Hello and welcome to lesson 28 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series, and today we'll be covering best chess openings. So what are the best chess openings and what makes them better than other chess openings? Now, if you're a beginner, you probably don't want to focus too much on the openings and spend your time on other things like tactics and endgames, but at some point you have to brush up on the openings and be aware of what different openings are out there. I did a previous video on opening systems, which you can check out. That's kind of a shortcut, but those may not be the best openings. So if we look here, the openings that are played most often, now with white, it looks like e4 is the number one move, then d4, and those two moves are played most often by a wide margin because they are two of the best opening moves. Why? Well, we'll start with e4. e4 controls the center. It allows your bishop to develop, your queen, but by moving e4, all you have to do is develop your bishop and then your knight, and then you'll be able to castle quickly. So if we go back, let's see, to d4, that's a close second because now you would have to develop not only the bishop and the knight, but the queen as well before you could castle. So that takes a little bit longer. And then the difference between e4 and d4 is that usually with e4, the position is more open most times. The pawns in the middle are traded off more often, and there's a more tactical game that develops from e4, whereas d4 tends to be more positional in nature most of the time. So let's dig in here with e4. If you're a beginner, you're thinking, okay, I play e4, and that's a good move to start with until you experiment with other openings, because this will help you develop your tactics. Now, the most common response here, it says, is c5, and then e5 is second. Now, at a beginner level, you'll probably see e5 more often. But why is c5 the most often played move? Well, it's one of the best responses because if you play e4, so if we take a look at that, what is e4, or excuse me, e5? If you play e5 after e4 is played, well then this usually prevents an immediate d4. It's possible to play this, but then that pawn could be captured. Then your queen would have to recapture. Well, you could try a gambit and give that pawn up, but your queen, if it captures, then it could be harassed by a knight. So, something like this. And we see that this is not played very often. Already we're down to only 1,800 games in this position, or a few more than that. So, once again, if we go back to e4, e5 is played to discourage you from playing d4, because if white is able, he should try and put both of his pawns in the center here to control a lot of valuable territory, to make it easier to develop his pieces. So c5 is one of the best openings to play the Sicilian defense because it basically also discourages d4 from being played immediately, but it can be played. There are options where you could play that, but we see that that is, let's see, d4 is the fourth most played move, so it is possible to gambit this pawn and move it to d4 immediately, but most often knight to f3 is played, where white just continues development, and now if he plays d4, this knight can recapture. So one of the best moves by black in the opening is this c5 move, the Sicilian defense, which after, let's see, if we play this out further, d6 is played most often, which allows your light squared bishop to develop. It fortifies this c-pawn. It controls e5 here. That way, if this pawn is pushed forward, it can be captured. So that way, if black wants to play knight to f6 and this pawn tries to harass the knight, well, the d pawn could just capture here on e5. All right, so now it looks like d4 is the most often played move. And then we have capture. So in the Sicilian defense, black gives up his pawn here on the side by capturing this more valuable central pawn. And most often the knight captures. And now play could continue with a number of moves. Most often this move is played attacking the unprotected pawn, and white usually protects with the knight. And now the most often move is a6, although knight to c6 could be played as well. You might ask why a6? Well, this prevents the knights from jumping into black's territory on b5. It prevents a pawn from checking on the pawn on a6 prevents the bishop from checking on b5. And so most often played here is either bishop to e3 or bishop to g5. But I won't dig much deeper into this because this can be a pretty complicated opening. So if we go back to the beginning, what are the best moves? Well, in the beginning, you have e4 or d4, both great moves. So after e4, there's a lot to learn if you want to dig deeper into openings. c5 is the Sicilian defense, which we just touched on. And there are different second moves that can be played for black. After you play this, the most common move, well then, instead of d6, this could be played also. Just developing this knight, helping control the center here. And white usually plays d4 once again to try and control the center. And black doesn't want to allow that, so capture. Then you capture with the knight. And if black really wanted to trade down material, he could capture further, but it's better to leave this knight here, because if you capture, then the queen will capture and white will have a developed queen in the center of the board covering a lot of real estate here. So most often played is knight to f6 attacking the pawn, or g6. But anyway, there you have it. That's a little introduction on one of the best openings, the Sicilian defense, e4 and c5. So if we go back and look at e4, and what is the second most played move? Well, it's e5, and you'll probably see this being played a lot by beginners. It keeps the center symmetrical and even. You both control important squares with your pawns placed there, and you can develop quickly and get castled quickly, and keep your king safer by castling. So once again, knight to f3 is most often played, and now you have the most common move being knight to c6 here. And then now, by far the most played move is bishop to b5. And so this is the Ruy Lopez, one of the best openings for white, but this can be a more complicated game, especially for beginners. And there are different options that can be played by black. Most common is a6, immediately forcing this bishop to make a decision by either capturing or retreating. And usually white will not want to give up his bishop pair, so the most common move is to retreat. And now, instead of chasing the bishop immediately, the most common move is knight to f6. attacking this center pawn, getting closer to being able to castle. And now white's most common move is to just go ahead and castle. And now we have bishop to e7, developing the bishop so black can castle. Now rook to e1, protecting this pawn. So now there could be a threat of attacking this pawn, maybe capturing the knight and then picking this pawn off. And black would not be able to counterattack by capturing white's pawn because it's protected now. So most often played is b5, now chasing the bishop back to b3, and then d6 to go ahead and protect this central pawn here. Anyway, the game could continue on. Most often c3 is played, and then black will go ahead and castle, and white will probably play h3 to prevent this bishop from developing and pinning the knight to the queen. And then there are many different variations from here where the Ruy-Lopez can become quite complicated with a lot of opening theory. So, most often played by beginners is e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and instead of bishop to b5, the Ruy-Lopez up here, we have bishop to c4, the Italian game. So this is something beginners play a little bit more often. It's not as complicated as the Ruy-Lopez, but there are still different variations to know. And most often it looks like bishop to c5 is played by black, and second most common move is knight to f6. So, two different moves you would have to look out for. And sometimes they both end up being played, well, most often they both end up being played in different orders. So here, white could go ahead and castle already if he wanted to, but the most common move is c3, getting ready to advance the d-pawn and support it with this c3 move. And also you might leave an escape hatch for your bishop as well, or you could even play b5 at some point and attack black's bishop that way. But we have knight to f6 now being played so black can castle. And then the most common moves are d3 or d4, and it looks like d3 is being played most often at this point. And so now d6 to go ahead and fortify this central pawn, and then white can castle, and now black can castle, or even play a6, leaving an escape hatch for the bishop here. So now, let's see, bishop to b3, bishop to a7. Now the knight can develop. Finally, black can go ahead and castle. And then now maybe h3 to prevent a pin on the knight. h6 doing likewise. And the game would continue on with just completion of development. Rook towards the center. Now we even have knight to h5 being the most common move, which would allow this f-pawn to push forward at some point and attack the center. All right, well, I don't want to dig too deep into individual openings, but those are two of the best openings after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, either bishop to b5, the Ruy-Lopez, or Spanish, it's also called, or bishop to c4, the Italian game. So those are your two options. Now there are other moves. One of the other best openings for white could also be the Scotch game here, which is the third most played move. And then in this position, you could have capture, knight captures, pawn attacks, or excuse me, knight attacks the pawn. And here, the most common move is to capture, doubling black's pawns and creating a slight weakness. Now, if you capture away from the center, there could be a queen exchange, and only 40 moves are played with capturing away from the center. So the most common move is to capture towards the center with your pawns, which is usually a good strategy. The only issue here is that now you're left with an isolated pawn that could be weak in the endgame. And you have 3 pawn islands compared to 2 by white here. So little clusters of pawns called pawn islands. The more you have of those, the harder it is to defend all of them. So after we have this exchange up here, it looks like e5, just going ahead and attacking the knight is most common. Then the queen moves to pin that pawn to the king so that it can't immediately capture the knight. And now queen to e2 is most often played. And now the knight has to move. So knight to d5, jumping into the center where it can control a lot of squares. But that allows c4, an attack on the knight. And here, most often played is bishop to a6, pinning this pawn to the queen. Although the knight could just retreat and attack this pawn, but at the moment it's protected by the queen. But if we look at the most commonly played move, there's a pin to the queen so that pawn can't capture the knight. And now b3 to just go ahead and protect the pawn. And here it looks like g6 is played most often. Or even castling queenside, even though you're castling into this broken pawn structure here. But it looks like g6 is played more often. And then f4, gaining space here. And now we have bishop to g7, so you may be able to castle on the king side here. And now let's see, queen to f2. But anyway, you get the picture. This is the Scotch game, which is another one of the best openings that you can play after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. So the 3 main moves. And why are these the 3 most often played moves? Because they're generally considered the best by practice through grandmasters and top chess masters, playing all these different openings and experimenting. And over the years and decades and even centuries, they find out what moves are best through experimenting with all the different possibilities. So, all right, we covered bishop to c4, the Italian game, bishop to b5, the Spanish game or Ruy Lopez, and the Scotch game, d4 here. And these different opening names may sound interesting, and some of them funny sounding, depending what the names are. And you might wonder, well, why do they have all these different names? Well, it's generally a name given to the opening by the person who first used that opening or even invented it, or the opening became popular because a famous player, chess master, played that opening, or the opening could be named after a place in the world where that game was played, that opening was played. Hence the Italian game. Maybe Italian chess masters were famous for playing the bishop to c4 move here, or the Spanish game invented by, or maybe, I think it was invented by Ruy Lopez, but maybe he was the first one to actually play it. But this move here, the Spanish game, the Ruy Lopez, and Ruy Lopez was Spanish. And then the Scotch game, perhaps it was played by Scotch players or masters. I don't exactly know, How that Scotch game, how the name came about, I would have to look that up. So next, let's go back to e4. Now, there are other options instead of e5 or c5. Both of those control the center immediately and discourage white from pushing this pawn to the center and gaining control with the ideal pawn pair in the center. Now, there are other openings that are some of the best openings that still attack the center, but they take a little longer to do that. So another famous opening is the French defense with e4, e6, and now the most common move is d4. Now, as usual, there are many other options, as you can see here, but most often d4 is played, and now you can push d5. So that was the reason behind this e6 move. It was to allow a push of the d5 or the d pawn to d5 to attack this e4 pawn. So now white is forced to make a decision. Do I defend this pawn? Do I trade it off by attacking? Do I push it forward and gain space? Those are all the different options that you would have in this French defense. Looks like most common is developing a knight and protecting the pawn. But then it can be pinned here to the king. So now the pawn would push forward because that knight can no longer protect it because the bishop is attacking here. So the pawn pushes forward, and now you've gained space in the center. But c5 can be played to attack the other pawn in the center. And now white forces that decision, or excuse me, forces that bishop to make a decision on what to do here. And most often the bishop captures. And then after a recapture, we've broken up the queenside pawns a little bit, leaving white with doubled pawns. But this pawn here on c3 protects this important d4 pawn. So now black normally just continues development. And the most common move now is queen to g4, the poisoned pawn variation, where white attacks this pawn and black has to make a decision on what to do. Should he let white capture that pawn? But it looks like most often played is castling here. But now white can play this move, aiming at the king side, and now we have knight to c6 here. And it looks like most often played is queen to h5, threatening a mate in one here. So knight to g6 is played to block the bishop covering that h7 square. And now white just continues development with knight to f3. And then we have queen developing to c7, lining up on the c3 pawn, possibly threatening a fork of the king and the rook on a1. And now we have development with bishop to e3, helping fortify the center. And here, looks like c4 is played most often. But anyway, you get the idea here. This is one example of how the French defense could play out. Let's see, after e4, e6, this is the French defense. And usually d4 is played. Now remember, there are always other options in many of these openings. These are just some of the best openings and best variations that are played most often because chess masters have discovered that they have the most success with these openings and these variations, and that's why they're just played more often. So second option here is this, knight to d2, the Tarrasch variation. So now knight to f6 can attack the pawn. The pawn pushes, forcing this knight to make a decision. Most often he retreats here. And now we have bishop to d3, aiming at the king side, c5 attacking the center, c3 protecting. The knight jumps into the center, putting more pressure on this pawn. So knight to e2 is played to help protect the center. And then capture here. Recapture. And now, let's see, f6, attacking the top of this pawn chain. So after capture, we have knight captures. And then looks like knight to f3 to help fortify the center here. But bishop to d6, and black is ready to castle kingside. White castles. Black holds off. Castling is the second most played move, but queen to c7, putting pressure along with the bishop here down through the center and aiming at the king side. And now we have bishop to g5, attacking this knight, and then castling. So another example of how the French defense can be played out. All right, so let's move on. After e4, we saw that e5 and c5 are two of the most often and best openings to play as black. We looked at e6, the French defense. So here's our options. e5, c5, the Sicilian defense. e6, the French defense, which allows you to push this pawn here to d5. But another way to do that after e4 is c6, the Caro-Kann defense, another of the best openings that black can play. And it looks like usually, once again, d4 is played, taking control of the center. And now d5 counterattacks here on this e4 pawn. Now e5 is played most often, but once again, knight to c3 can be played to cover this pawn. But if e5 is played, gaining more space, then the bishop is developed outside of the pawn chain, because usually e6 is played, and that would block this bishop in. So now we have knight to f3, e6, closing the chain and fortifying the center here. But now we have bishop to e2, getting ready to castle, knight to d7, castling, knight to e7, knight to d2. And although this blocks the bishop in for the moment, we'll see what happens here as the game progresses. h6, knight moves out of the way to b3, but now helps control this square. g5, the pawns start pressing forward, getting ready to attack white's king side. And now an interesting move played most often is knight to e1, retreating back and opening up this queen-bishop battery, possibly to slow down black's progress here. Queen to c7, getting ready maybe to push this pawn forward and open up a line here on the queen side. So we have knight to d3, putting more restraint and control on this c5 square. Knight to g6, moving towards the king side. Bishop to e3. Anyway, I don't want to dig too deep, because especially if you're a beginner and you're trying to follow all of this, you'll just have to practice these different openings on your own, figure out what you like and what you don't like. You could play over Chessmaster games to see how they handle these different openings, and pick a chess hero, somebody that you like their style and you like their games and they look interesting, and you can see how they play these different openings. All right, so let's see. After e4, we had e5, or c5, the Sicilian defense, e6, the French defense, or c6, the Caro-Kann. So those are the top 4 openings after e4. So I won't dig too much deeper into those other responses. One other thing I want to look at really quickly here is after e4, e5. Now you can play knight to c3. There are other options, but knight to f3 is probably one of the best openings to start with. And now the second most played move here is the Petrov's defense. So you have white attacking this e5 pawn, and black counterattacks the e4 pawn. So most often played is capture. But normally you don't want to do this immediately. The best move is to attack with d6, driving this knight back, because there are some little tricks here. Let's say this is played, and then something like this. Let's see. If black would make the mistake of retreating back like this, well, now you have this little surprise here with knight to c6. So a little trap where you're attacking the queen, but white's queen is checking the king. So what can he do? If he tries to block with the queen, the knight will capture the queen. If he blocks with the bishop, well, then the knight will capture the queen. So looks like most often played is that, but then you just capture and you're winning here. So that is something to really watch out for after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, the Petrov's defense. Once white captures here, the best move is to drive that knight away first. So white's best response is just to retreat back here and help guard the king side, and now that gives you time to capture. So now if white goes ahead with the queen to e2 here, well, you can just go ahead and block a discovered attack with your queen. So now what can white do? White could chase the knight away with d3, but after this retreat, you could just exchange queens off here, or black could ignore this and just develop. Or excuse me, white could ignore the queen exchange and just develop. So what happens most often in the Petrov's defense after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, capture, drive the knight away first, then capture. Usually this is played d4, then d5, keeping things even, protecting this knight, bishop to d3, putting pressure on the knight and getting ready to castle. So another reason that these openings are considered best is because they incorporate a lot of very logical moves, and the moves tend to do more than one thing. So here we have a bishop developing to d3 that puts a piece towards the center, helps control an important square in the center, this e4 square, attacks your opponent's knight, and gets ready for white to be able to castle here on the next move if he needs to. So now, most often played is this, maybe threatening to attack this bishop. White ignores that and castles. Then we have bishop to e7, c4, attacking this central pawn. And now it looks like b4, knight to b4, attacking the bishop is played most often. And then to keep the bishop pair, there's a retreat, black finally castles here, and now white can play c3 attacking the center. And now we have bishop to f5 protecting, a3 attacking this knight, and it looks like that is usually ignored because of this capture attacking the queen and the bishop. So capture towards the center here, fortifying the central pawn on d4. And now the knight has to retreat. And then it looks like rook to e1, rook to e8, so these rooks could fight for the open file here in the future. And then capture, white captures. White captures, getting rid of his doubled pawn here after the queen captures. And then developing to f4, attacking this unprotected pawn. So the rook covers that. And then h3, making an escape hatch for the king or even the bishop here. Maybe preventing any future pins on our knight to the queen if this bishop moves on e2. And then h6, also leaving an escape hatch for the bishop or the king. And then now knight to d2 here. Maybe getting ready to attack the queen by moving the bishop to c4. So that was an example of the Petrov's defense, one of the best solid defenses after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f3, knight to f6 here. So after e4, you have e5. Knight to f3 is played most often, and this is a solid defense, but more often you'll see knight to c6 here. All right, those are some of the best openings, and I can't cover everything, so let's jump real quick to the second most played move by white is d4. So if you see this move, or you decide to play it, what will be played most often? Well, it looks like knight to f6 is played most often by quite a bit. And this is kind of a developing move, a controlling of the center move, and it's a waiting move to see what white will do next. And c4 is played most often. Second is knight to f3 here. Also maybe a waiting move, kind of copies what black is doing. But because a pawn has not been moved to the center, white wants to take control of the center, so most often played is c4. Now e4 is not normally played because you would just give up this pawn, the knight could capture. So c4, the next best thing. If you can't put your two pawns in the center, maybe put one of the pawns on the side, up 2 squares here beside the other center pawn to help control one of the middle squares here. And remember, it's very important to control the center throughout a chess game. And that's why these are some of the best openings in chess, is because they try to fortify and control and attack the center. And usually whoever succeeds and does it in a better way, attacking and controlling the center, will have an advantage and probably go on to win the game. So now, it looks like most often played is e6. G6 can be played. So if we look at this move, now knight to c3 is usually played to get ready to push this e pawn and really take control of the center. So the knight is pinned here. And this is the Nimzo Indian defense. So now e3 is played, ignoring the pin, fortifying your d pawn. And now black usually castles. Then bishop to d3 is played to help keep the knight out of this central square. And then d5 here, knight to f3, so the pieces just develop. and then c5. So we have a fight here building up in the center. White ignores that and castles, but now we have the knight developing, putting more pressure on in the center, and white usually forces this bishop to make a decision: capture or retreat. So after capture and the pawn captures, white is left with a damaged queenside pawn structure, which could be a long-term weakness into the endgame, and we have doubled pawns here. So now looks like the most common move is to just capture here, bishop captures, and then queen develops, lining up on this unprotected bishop, which could cause some issues. And so bishop retreats to d3, lining up on the king side, and now e5 is played most often, attacking this strong central pawn formation that white has. So this is usually played just developing the queen. Rook lines up on the center, and then we have e4 here, gaining space in the center. And now, interesting move, most often played is c4, although we could have one of these pawns just capturing in the middle. But this is an interesting move. It looks like it's giving up this pawn. So after a capture, we have another capture, and then recapture, and now knight. Here there are different possibilities, but I'm not going to go into this too deep. This is something you have to just check out by playing some of these openings yourself. Looks like knight to a5 is played by far, attacking the bishop, and then the queen, bishop and queen are lined up here. So after a retreat, we have an exchange of queens, and then the knight jumps in and captures this pawn, keeping the material even, but leaving white with two isolated weak pawns here. So now we have rook to e1, lining up on this rook, a potential back rank mate threat here. So this is played, helping protect the knight and get rid of the back rank mate threat. So now looks like bishop to f4, knight, wrong move, knight to d6, and then multiple options here. White could exchange off the bishop here. He could attack and exchange off a rook. What else? He could just move this bishop over here to a4 and attack the rook. But you get the idea. All right, so that was the Nimzo Indian defense. Let's look at it again. Nope, wrong pawn. d4, and then knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to c3, helping to fortify the center, and then bishop to b4, the Nimzo Indian, pinning the knight to the king. So one of the best openings for black to play against white. So another option after d4 and knight to f6 is, let's see, c4. And instead of e6 going for the Nimzo Indian, you can do the King's Indian defense here, which I covered a little bit in the opening systems that you can try, because you could set up this type of King's Indian defense structure no matter what white does, sort of. You have to kind of look at each move and just double check that you're not falling into some unusual trap, of course. But you can try and just go for this structure in different options depending on what white plays. So After knight to c3, the most common move, well, then you just develop your bishop and it's lined up down through the center, aiming at the queen side, and you're ready to castle immediately. So white normally takes control of the center. That's why he brought this knight up here to c3 to help allow this pawn to move to e4. So to stop or slow white's progress and prevent him from just pushing forward and attacking the knight, d6 is usually played. So now, if we look, do they even show e4 on here? I don't even think it's in here. E4 or e5, sorry. E5. Yeah, I don't even see e5 on here. And probably because it's usually not a good idea to push this forward. White could still push forward and attack the knight, but then black would capture. And then after a recapture, the queens could be exchanged, preventing white from castling. And then white's center is broken apart here. So normally, knight to f3 is played, and then black just castles here. And so white will continue development, getting ready to castle. And now e5 is most commonly played. White ignores that and castles. And then we have, let's see, knight to c6, building pressure on this d4 pawn. So the pawn jumps forward, gaining space in the center, attacking the knight. The knight retreats. And then here, the most common move is kind of a tricky one. We have a retreat to e1, which allows this f pawn to push forward. So the same is done here by black. So the f pawns can push forward because, as we noticed, the center is blocked up here. And because these pawns can't move, play will continue on the wings. So that's why the D pawn openings are a little more complicated, because the center usually is closed and play will continue on the wings. So now we have knight to d3, f5, bishop just develops, knight to f6 here, f3, f4 gaining space and aiming. Everything is aiming down towards the king side. But you get the idea here. So that is an option of how the King's Indian defense can be played after d4, knight to f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7, e4, d6 to slow down any pawn advances, and then knight develops, king castles, bishop to e2, getting ready to castle as well. So one of the best openings and a solid defense for black, the King's Indian defense, but a little more complicated. So at beginner level, after d4, you might see the second most played move more often, d5. Well, now the most common move is this, the Queen's Gambit. And this is one of the best openings for white. So here we have different options. You can play e6, the Queen's Gambit declined, or if we go back after d4, d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit, looks like most often played is c6 here, the Slav defense. So now white would just continue developing the knight. Knight develops, other knight, e6, fortifying the center. And now the game has gone into the semi-Slav defense. e3, although this blocks in the bishop. Knight develops, queen to c2, bishop to d6, Bishop to d3, lining up on the king side. Castle. Castle. And then play will continue with a battle here in the center. Maybe black captures first, bishop captures, b5 attacking this bishop. The bishop retreats, bishop to b7 aiming at the king side, rook to d1, moving behind this advanced pawn here. Queen to c7, creating a battery, aiming at the king side. And then e4 here, gaining space. So now it looks like, usually e5 is played. Then maybe attacking the knight. But you get the idea. Another one of the best openings. This was the Slav defense, and it went into the semi-Slav. But before we dig into too many crazy variations, I'll just go back to the beginning after d4, d5, c4, the queen's gambit. The second most played move is this, e6, the queen's gambit declined. So a solid defense here by black. Now knight to c3, adding more pressure on this d5 square is played most often. Knight develops to help protect. And then looks like most often played is c takes d5 here. Although the bishop could move up and pin this knight to the queen. That's another possibility. Or you could just develop your other knight. But most often played is this, the exchange variation. And now we have a recapture. So black will have a half-open e-file to try and use to his advantage, and white will try and attack up this half-open c-file later in the game. So now we have bishop pinning the knight, breaking of the pin with bishop to e7, e3 fortifies the center, c6 does likewise. Then bishop to d3, knight develops, queen to c2, creating a battery aimed at the king side. But black is not afraid of that at the moment. He just castles. White develops his knight, getting ready to castle as well. And then we have rook to e8, getting ready to apply pressure down the half-open e-file. And white could castle queen side or king side here, but usually he castles king side as the queen side is more open here. So castle, knight to f8 here, guarding this h7 square, and also with the possibility of jumping forward and blocking with the knight. So now we have f3. Limiting any movement forward for this knight, and also fortifying the e4 central square to possibly push this e-pawn forward. e6 developing, rook at a to d1, which is an interesting move. You would think maybe they would go here, but this c-pawn is blocking the path of the rook. So also, white wants to probably push this e-pawn, and then there will be less of a defense on this d-pawn, so the rook can defend the d-pawn as well. So now rook to c8, getting ready to maybe push this pawn forward. King to h1, getting off of this diagonal, these dark squared lines here. The bishop may end up here and aimed at the king. So now we have a6, preventing the knight from jumping forward after this pawn is pushed. And a3, limiting the scope of the dark squared bishop. And anyway, you get the picture. I probably have said that too many times in this video, but I can't dig into too many lines. The video is already going long. But I hope these these different openings, little introductions to some of these best chess openings, will help you get a little taste of the different possibilities of openings, especially if you're a beginner and you're trying to figure out what to play. So if you're a beginner, I would definitely recommend starting with e4 because there's more tactics in the e4 openings, and you definitely need to work on and learn tactics when you're starting out in chess. And then after you've tried that for a while, and I would give it a good few months, maybe 6 months or more of trying an opening and playing the different variations, depending how often you play chess, to see if you're having success, if you like the openings and the positions that come out of the opening. Because remember, openings aren't the most important part of chess. I would say, probably tactics, especially if the tactics are in the area of your opponent's king, then you can checkmate them. So that definitely takes precedence. So study your tactics, strategy, end games, openings. You can study those a little bit. Unless you really love studying openings, well then, you want to have fun in chess. So go ahead and put a little extra time into opening study, but don't go too crazy at the expense of learning other areas in chess that could help you win more games possibly. All right, so e4, I'd recommend that when you're starting out, one of the best openings. If you like tactics or you need to practice tactics. Now, if you like to play more strategy and positional chess, try d4. So d4, the position tends to be closed usually, especially if you have something like d4, d5, even with c4. They can capture here, which is the Queen's Gambit accepted, but then we have knight to f3, maybe knight to f6 next, e3 fortifying this pawn, e6 allowing the bishop to develop, capture of the pawn, and now c5 counterattacking in the center. White ignores that and castles. Then a6 to prevent any checks on the king and maybe to get ready to push and attack the bishop. So we have a capture here. And now usually trade of queens, rook captures, and now the bishop captures. And then we have knight moving to d2. So that's pretty interesting, castling. Now, by doing that, this knight could possibly jump here to b2 and then jump into the center. And that way, if it's captured, the other knight could recapture. So here we have bishop to e2 retreating is played most often, guarding this rook here, I guess, and the knight possibly. Rook to d8, pinning the knight, but because the bishop has moved here to protect the rook, now the knight is not really pinned because it can move and the bishop can cover this rook. So the rook on d8 can't just snatch up the rook on d1 and checkmate white once this knight moves away. So we have let's see, knight to e5, interesting here. If the knight captures white's knight on e4, well then you have rook capturing here on d8. So, what would happen here? Well, black, maybe captures. He's in check, so he would have to capture here. But then this could happen. So If we go back, knight to e5, is that a mistake? It looks like it probably is here, because knight to e5, well then the game doesn't continue anymore because of this rook capture, forcing something to be done, and then this knight is not protected here. So capture, and then black would just go up a piece. So something to avoid in that variation. All right, well, let's wrap this up. Let's see if there are any more best chess openings that you can play. For white, there are a few more. Knight to f3 is the third most played move, the Reddy opening. So, named after, I believe, Richard Reddy, famous chess master from maybe 100 years ago. So, this is kind of a waiting move. You want to develop this knight here to f3 usually anyway, but you can wait and see what black is going to do. And a lot of times black will just return the favor, knight to f6, waiting to see what white does now. And then you could play c4 here, which transposes into the English opening. So that is another one of the main openings that can be played. Normally here you'll have something like this. The other knight develops, bishop develops, so we're getting kind of a King's Indian defense set up. And now e4, d6, so the King's Indian set up. After d4, now we're in what's called the modern defense, which is very interesting that they call it that, because this is the same kind of setup that appears in the King's Indian defense. So, I don't know. I would argue that this is also a King's Indian defense here. So after castle, well, now it says we're in the King's Indian defense, normal variation. So that is another thing you have to be aware of when you pick some of the best openings. Transpositions, which I don't know if I've covered that in this series, but that's when you start out in one opening, but then with a certain sequence of moves, you veer off into another opening, and that can be pretty tricky, especially if you're familiar with one opening and suddenly you end up in a different opening that you don't normally play. And so that's a little bit more complicated stuff that I won't cover in an opening in this chess beginner to winner series. I won't cover that in a beginner opening series. So once again, this knight to f3 move, the Reddy opening, that is a good option, one of your best options that you may want to experiment with in the future. Also, we have c4, which is the English opening, which I just mentioned, that the Reddy opening transposed into. And it looks like knight to f6 is played most often. Then knight to c3 here. Now g6, g3, bishop develops, bishop develops. Black is already castled, so e4 can be played, gaining space in the center. And then d6. We go into this King's Indian defense setup again. Knight develops, and now c5. So because this pawn has not moved to d4 yet, c5 is played, so it can, if the pawn moves forward, you can exchange off your less valuable flank pawn for the more valuable central pawn. And white usually castles, knight develops, and then d3 here. So a6, h3, preventing any bishop attacks on g4. Now we have rook to b8, a4 to slow down a pawn push on the queen side by black. Knight to e8, perhaps getting ready to push this f pawn once again. And so white goes first, pushing the f-pawn. Now the second most played move is f5 here, but looks like knight to c7 is played most often. And so white just moves ahead with his plan. When the center is a little blocked up here, then a lot of times you have to play on the wing, although the center is a little more fluid here. But black pushes ahead on the queen side. We have capture towards the center. Likewise by black. White captures here. Knight captures. Knight captures. Rook captures. And now knight jumps up here to a better square, attacking the rook, and the rook retreats. Then we have g4. And knight jumps into this outpost on d4, a strong position for this knight. And white does the same, although he could possibly be chased away with a pawn push here on e7, or from e7 to e6. So now this is usually played, developing the bishop and aiming down the diagonal at the king side. All right. Well, I went a little deeper than I should have probably there. So, once again, e4, one of the best opening moves, good for tactics. d4, a solid, more positional and strategic opening for white. Knight to f3, the ready opening, which is kind of a waiting move to see what your opponent will do. And then the English opening, c4. Now, I don't know if I would recommend this for beginners. This English opening can get a little bit complicated. So you can try it out and see what you think, but it might be a little more complicated even than the d4 strategic games. And especially if you're starting out, e4 is a good, solid, straightforward move that helps to get you castled quickly. If you like tactics, there will be more tactics involved usually in the e4 openings. But just remember, any opening can be steered into a more tactical game or positional game, depending on how you follow up with the opening. So that's why openings, especially when you're 2,000 and under, the openings just aren't as important as other areas of chess, because as long as you play solid in the opening and don't blunder anything or give up too much material, usually the games will be decided in the middle game by tactics, or even in the end game by tactics or long-term end game strategy, by trying to promote a pawn or gain more space or take advantage of damaged pawn structures or weak pawns. All right, back to the best chess openings. e4 for white, d4 for white, knight to f3, and c4. And so there are other openings you can try, but those are the major ones and some of the best openings. So after e4, what are the best responses for black? Well, if you're a beginner, maybe start out with e5. You could try c6, which is a little more complicated, a counter-attacking strategy. If you want to play a little safer, you could try e6, the French defense, or after e4, a very solid defense for black is c6, the Caro-Kann defense. So definitely look at that. Even if you're a beginner, if you've been playing e4, e5 for a while, and maybe it's too crazy or too many tactics, you could try the c6 Caro-Kann defense for a more positional, solid game. What else do we have here after e4? Um, we have d6, the Pyrrhic defense, which I won't go into this one. You know, this could transpose into a King's Indian type defense. Um, but I don't know. This might be a little bit more complicated, especially for beginners. And I won't really cover this one today. So let's see. Anything else? G6, you could play that immediately. Once again, it could maybe transpose into a King's Indian type of defense. Oh, one other thing I forgot to mention that you will see sometimes is this, D5. So, is this one of the best openings by black? I don't know about that because it allows a capture here, the queen captures, and then the knight can harass the queen. So, in the opening, this looks like it's not the greatest opening for black. It's still pretty solid. The queen could either retreat back to d6 or d8 even, but usually the queen will move here to a5, where it's kind of out of the line of fire of white's pieces, but the queen is lined up on white's king. So normally d4 will be played, just taking control of the center. Then knight to f6, knight to f3, c6, leaving an escape hatch if the queen wants to retreat. Also helping control this d5 square as well. So now we have bishop to c4, developing the bishop, getting ready to castle. Bishop to f5, bishop to d2, breaking the pin on this knight, and lining up on the queen here. e6, knight, let's see, to d5. Okay, well that's interesting. Knight can jump up here to d5 with a discovered attack on the queen. So the queen retreats to cover the c7 square so that knight can't fork here. And then normally this capture is made. And now the queen could recapture so you don't have a broken pawn structure, or most often played looks like that move. But now you can develop your bishop here and maybe have an open or half open file down to white's king side. So after bishop retreats, looks like that's one of the most common moves. The knight develops, protecting this pawn, which is unprotected. Queen to e2, so now white could castle queenside if he doesn't want to be stuck here with this half open file aimed right at the king. Queen to c7, lining up on the king side. Knight to h4, attacking the bishop. Bishop retreats, and white does usually castle queenside, not wanting to worry about this half open g file. And black castles there as well. So then we have g3, kind of blocking any attacks by a rook down the g file. And bishop develops, knight captures, pawn captures towards the center instead of undoubling the pawns. And now we have h4 blocking the path of the rook, f5 pushing forward here, and bishop to g5 attacking. So the rook would have to move. He goes here, lining up on the queen. And then we just continue forward here. Let's see. Capture. Rook captures. Either could capture here. Or, let's see. It looks like f4 is played most often. So f4. Now the bishop is kind of trapped in. Do Do you want to capture here? Probably not because of this queen and bishop battery. Anyway, I've done it again. I've dug way too deep into this one opening. So I better follow up here or finish up. Okay, as a recap, the best chess openings. As a beginner, I would recommend that you play e4 when you're starting out. But if you're not a beginner, maybe you could try d4, the queen's pawn opening. And if you want to experiment further, the ready opening with knight to f3, c4, the English opening. And then usually with e4, you'll have to worry about e5, e6, the French defense, c5, the Sicilian defense, or c6, the Caro-Kann defense. Let's see. There are some other options, but I won't dig into those today. If we go back to, let's see. Oh, actually, one more thing, or a couple more things. The Scandinavian defense, which is what we kind of just looked at. But, then you should probably just capture and pull their queen into the center, and then you can attack like we just saw with the knight here. All right, one other thing was the Petrov's defense. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, attacking here. And just remember, if you attack, they attack, you could attack their knight, and if they retreat, you have this trap where you move here, attacking their queen, and a discovered check, and then the queen will be trapped. Because if you block, the knight captures, or if you block with the bishop, the knight still captures the queen. So that's something interesting to remember in the Petrov's defense. So normally e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6. Once white captures, remember to chase that knight back first, and then you can capture. And white normally plays forward. You can do the same and protect your knight. All right. Now, what normally happens after e4, e5, and knight to f3 is the knight to c6 move here. And then you can play as a beginner. I would recommend bishop to c4, the Italian game. Once you have more experience, you could try the Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5. But this can be a more complicated game with a lot of theory to learn and remember. What are some of the other options? The Scotch game, d4. So that's a good opening to try out as a beginner. It kind of breaks the center open. Usually they'll capture here. Then you can recapture. And you have plenty of room to develop your pieces, get your king castle to safety. All right, let's see. And as a more strategic player, you might want to play d4. And as a beginner, you might see this more often, d4, d5. And then you can try out the Queen's Gambit with c4. Now, I didn't go over your other possibilities. You could play knight to f3, which is the second most common move. And then if they respond the same way, well, then you have options. You can follow up once again with c4. You could try something that you've probably seen a lot of, the London system, where, let's see now, let's say they play safe like this. You could do the same. Then if they develop here, you just retreat back. And now if they castle, you just develop. And what do we have? c5 here. You just fortify. The queen jumps here. You can play bishop to d3. Knight develops. But anyway, you get the picture. This is kind of the London system setup, which It's probably one of the best, solid openings, especially if you're a beginner and starting out. You could try this London system, which, if I go back, it's kind of a D4. They don't even have to play an immediate D5. They could play this. You could develop here immediately, and then let's see. If they do this, you could still try the London system with something like this. Let's see. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up here. Openings if you're not careful, you can dig into openings and learning openings and just spend so much time on that and at the expense of learning other things in chess. So let's conclude here. The best openings: E4 for tactics. Okay. For white, the best openings: E4, D4 for a more strategic game. You could play knight to F3, the ready opening, and wait and see what your opponent does. The English opening with C4 is a little more complicated. All right, now after E4, many different openings. You'll usually see E5 from beginners, but you have E6, the French defense, which is more solid. Also solid is the C6 Caro-Kann defense. If you want to attack a little bit more, C5, the Sicilian defense. And let's see, I better jump to D4. So after D4, a lot of times you'll see knight to F6 and different variations that follow from that. The King's Indian defense, you could see there are other possibilities that I won't dig into right now. But as beginners, usually beginners will play this, D5, and then you can play knight to F3. You could play bishop to F4, or even knight to C3. But most often played is this, the Queen's Gambit. And a lot of beginners might play E6, the Queen's Gambit declined, or after D4, D5, C4, they could play this, the Slav defense with C6 here. Or they could play the Queen's Gambit accepted and just capture here. And you could, most often played is to ignore that capture, just keep developing. So if they develop E3, E6, finally you capture this pawn. They might try and counterattack in the center. You could ignore that and just castle, and so on. All right. Okay, finally, I'll wrap it up there. So I just showed you some of the best chess openings, especially if you're a beginner. Different ones that you can try and experiment with and see what you like and what you don't. So just remember, openings are great. If you really enjoy openings and you're having fun, then go ahead and dive right in. But remember to study the other important areas of chess as well: tactics, endgames, strategy, and play regularly too, of course, and analyze your games afterwards if you can. That'll make a big difference. All right, well, thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Feel free to leave comments, suggestions, or any requests for future chess video material that you would like to see. If there's anything you really want to see, just leave a comment with that request, and I'll try and work on that. So thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.